I'm gonna try to start by a little poll I'm gonna wanna do with you. This is borrowed from a colleague of mine who's studying self-control and how things happen in our brain. And I wanna just ask you, how many of you have ever woke up putting an alarm to say 8 a.m. and as soon as you woke up, you just press the snooze button for say 10 more minutes, asking for a little more sleep? How many of you ever did that? Okay. How many of you ever texted while driving, even though you know it's pretty bad for you, you still did that? I imagine that about you. Good. How many of you have ever had unprotected sex with someone that you don't know? That's no one. Okay. The point of those examples that were given by my friend Dan is that we all have in our brain some person sitting inside who knows what's right and what's wrong, making decisions, telling us what's good and what's not good. But we sometimes don't listen to that person. We sometimes operate by a different person. We sometimes have this kind of conflict in our brain that determines what we're going to do, even though we know inside that maybe there's something different about it. And I think that the organ that is in control of those things is an organ sitting upper in our head, which is our brain. And I'm going to try to convince you in the next couple of minutes that we can now see, using electrodes inside the brain, how this conflict is resolved in the brain and how you make those decisions that you make by yourself. Okay. So let me first convince you that there is a reason to study the brain in order to make those decisions by telling you two stories. So story number one is the story of this guy, Charles Whitman. The younger people in the audience don't know him. He's a guy that in 1966 went to the University of Austin in Texas, climbed the tallest building in the university, took an AK-47 and started shooting people downstairs. He killed 13 right away. He waited for the emergency people to show up, and then he started shooting them. And he killed a number of people before the police actually shot him and killed him. And then they went to see what went wrong. Why did this guy do what he do? And they went to his neighbors, and of course, the classical story, he was a great neighbor, a Boy Scout teacher, used to walk the dogs of his neighbors, a great guy. Turned out he also volunteered in a lot of things. He was a really nice guy, and there was no understanding of why would he suddenly wake up one day and start shooting people, until they found his diary. And in his diary, they saw that he actually recorded events in his life, and he started reporting recently that he feels that something has happened to him. Something is strange about him. He says, I feel I'm not myself. I feel I might do something bad soon, and if I do that, I want my brain to be looked at. I want an autopsy. And he actually leaves a check for $30,000 to have this autopsy done on him, which they then do. And as they do, they indeed find out that he has a massive tumor pressing on his amygdala, part of the brain that has to do with emotions and with anger, and maybe with violent behavior. So the question is, what does it mean about him? Was he totally at fault or not? Here's a more recent story from San Diego. A woman calls the doctors one day and says, my husband, who was a 40-year-old man, who had a perfect normal sexual appetite for years, suddenly became a pedophile. And we have 2 daughters, and I'm afraid for them, and I want something to be done. So they take him and they check him, and they find out that he has this big tumor pressing on the forehead, on a part of the brain that is in the front that actually has to do with decisions. And they remove this tumor. And as soon as they remove that, he goes back to being normal again. Same appetite he had before. And then a year later, she calls again and says, you know, my husband has the same thing again. I think something is wrong again. So they take him again to the doctors, and they see that some residues of the tumor are still there. Then take it again, everything is normal. This is almost a control experiment. You have something, you behave one way, you take it out, you behave differently, and then again. This is like science experiment. And you can all do it on yourself if you want, because as you all know, there's some things that we can consume that change our behavior, that make us be funnier, cuter, look more attractive to other people. There's a little molecule, ethanol, that we can put in our body. You all probably tried it last night, and suddenly the world looks a little bit different to us. We all change our behaviors very easily by just changing what we interact with in the world. And the way to look at it, one way, is to study the brain from the inside, which is what I do. So in the last 8 years, a surgeon in UCLA and myself and a team of 12 other people, we've been working with patients who undergo brain surgery. And during the surgery, these patients have electrodes placed inside their brain for clinical purposes in order to find out what's the problem. And then we keep them there for about a week or two with their brain open and with those wires inside their brain when they're awake for the surgeon to find out what is the problem and then remove the problem. But while we're doing that, we actually have a unique thing. We have a human being awake in bed with open brain and electrodes placed deep inside his or her brain, allowing us to do studies on their brain and investigate how the brain works, which is what we do. And here's an example of what we can learn from looking inside the brains of people. Here's one patient. This woman was sitting in the hospital and watching movies. You're going to see now a bunch of clips that she's watching. What you're going to hear is the activity of one brain cell of hers as she listens to these movies. If you want to know how brain cells sound, here's an example. Here's a visualization of one brain cell, and if you put electrodes next to brain cells, what you hear is something like that. Those spikes, those firing, is one brain cell speaking to its neighbors and telling them, I care about something in the world. All those cells, when they do this, indicate to other cells something interesting is happening. And now it's our job as scientists to find out what happened in the world that made this cell fire. So here's the example. Here's this woman sitting there.
Welcome to Hollywood. Everybody comes to Hollywood, got a dream. What's your dream? I have a dream.
What you don't see is the movies, but you hear the movies and you hear the clicks. Try to see what this cell cares about.
Welcome to Wall Street and the New York Stock Exchange, the world's largest and surprisingly one of...
So this activity that you heard was happening when the patient was watching a movie of The Simpsons. Every time she sees The Simpsons, the cell started firing. This is a small cell in her brain that comes to life when she views The Simpsons, when she thinks of The Simpsons. And she has many of those cells in her brain that encode this one thing. And this is, in a way, how a thought looks. A pattern of activity of one cell while this woman watches The Simpsons. And what's interesting about this cell is that it doesn't fire only when she watches The Simpsons. It actually fires every time she thinks of The Simpsons. And the way I know that is because we came back to this woman and asked her the following questions. We told her, now, don't look at the screen, kind of like what you do right now. Just try to recall which movies you've seen. So she's going to say, I've seen a movie about the pyramids in Egypt, and I've seen the movie, I don't know, Cocktail with Tom Cruise. Those are all movies that she's seen. And at some point, she's going to remember having seen this Simpson cartoon. And she's going to say, oh, The Simpson. But what's interesting, I'm going to play to you in a second, is that we're going to hear the cell firing before she says The Simpson. We're going to hear her remembering. We're going to see memories in action. Here it is. She says something about New York. That's the one clip she's seen.
The Hollywood sign.
The Hollywood sign. It's another movie she's seen.
Simpsons.
The Simpsons. So we saw her remembering about a second and a half before she actually verbalized her memory. And for her, the experience of saying The Simpsons was momentary. When I speak to you right now, I feel as if the words that I say just come out of my mouth as I think them. I don't really think what I am going to say next. I just say it. In effect, you and I hear what I say at the same time. We're both observers of this behavior of my brain. But we know now that the brain maybe decided a little before what is about to happen. And if this is true, there's a lot we can do about that. For instance, we can maybe find cells that tell us that something is about to happen before not just we know, but before the patient knows. It looks something like that. Here's an experiment where a patient was watching a clock on the screen. You see this clock in front of the screen. And we tell the patient the clock is going to revolve. You're going to see the dial moving around. And what we want you is to decide at any given moment, whenever you want, to press a button and stop the clock. So you're going to press a button and the clock's going to stop. And this is what they're asked to do. But then when they stop the clock, we call this moment P, the moment of the press. Here it's at exactly 30. We ask them to also do something else. We tell them, can you tell us when you felt the urge to press the button? When you feel the moment that you wanted to? And they say, well, I guess it was a little bit before, and they move the dial a little backwards to when they felt the urge. And they do it again and again. Every time they see the clock revolving, they press a button, the clock stops, and they say, I stopped it here, and I felt the desire to a little before. And then we say, okay, so far so good. Let's look at this person's brain. And what we see in his or her brain, I'm going to show you in a second, we see that there are cells that become active before the button is pressed, but even more so. They are active before the moment the patient perceives as the moment that they made a choice. So we see first the choice in the brain, the moment the patient knows about the choice, and the moment the choice gets to happen. Here it is. W is the moment where they had the will, the desire. P is the button press, and you see the sounds a little before this W. So this is interesting. We know something is about to happen, not just before it happens, but before the patient perceived the desire for it to happen. And if this is true, then we can do something much nicer. We can actually play the patient's brain against the patient in the following way. We tell the patient, now let's play a different game. In this game, you have a button in front of your eyes, and this button, just a red button, you can choose to press this button whenever you want. That's all. So you sit there, and whenever you want to, press this button. When you press the button, a light comes on, and we tell the patient, this is the moment when we save the data from your brain. So when the light is on, don't touch the button at all, just wait. So the patient sits there. Whenever they feel like it, they press the button, they press it, lights come on, it's on for a few seconds when we save the data, then it turns off again, and a new trial begins. And now we can actually do the same thing. Have the patient sit there, wait, whenever they want to, press the button, light turns on, we save data, turn off, we start again. This is it. This is it according to the patient. But here's what really happens. We find in the patient's brains cells that tell us, say, in 3 seconds, the patient is going to press the button. So what we do is the following. We wait for the patient to want to press the button. We see his wanting in the brain. And then we wait a little less than 3 seconds, and we turn the lights by ourselves. So what happens is the patient sits there. He is about to press the button, and just before he's touching it, it turns on by itself. And so he touches the button when the light's already on. And there's a buzzer in the room. We tell the patient, we told you not to press the button when the light's already on. This affects the experiment. So if the light's on, don't press it. He says, oh, I'm sorry, doctor, not going to happen again. Then he sits there. He wants to. We know he wants to. We turn the lights by ourselves, and he presses the button when the light's already on. Again, a buzzer. I'm sorry, doctor, it kind of happened by itself. Never mind, just don't do it again. And every time the patient wants to do something, we know that they're about to do that, and we, in a way, interact with them by affecting their behavior. They want to do something, and we do something a little before them because of their brain, against them. They try to fool us. They try to do it faster, do faster. They cannot. I'm sitting inside their brain. They try to trick us. They try to use the right hand and then move with the left. It doesn't work because we're sitting inside their brain. As soon as they know they want something, I know they want something. And I can always play them against themselves. And what's interesting about that is not the fact that we can actually find when you want something and then play it against you. What's interesting is the following things. Sometimes we know at time 0 that you're about to press the button, and we wait a little bit for you to know it yourself, and then just when you're reaching to do that, we turn it on by ourselves. But sometimes we don't wait. As soon as we know, we turn it on. And then something interesting happens. Your brain wanted something. We activated this button because of your brain, but you don't know it because it didn't get to you yet. So your unconscious told us something. We already operated the world based on your unconscious, and the button turns on without you knowing why. The patient sits there, he sees the buttons are turning on, off, and they say, well, I don't know what this to do with me. I don't feel that I'm responsible for that. But we know that they are. It's their brain that decided. And we know that their brain knows that because after a while, the brain gets tired of this thing where they try something and nothing happens, so it stops. Now, this is a unique moment. This is a unique moment where we actually get to talk to your unconscious behind your back. Now, what's interesting about what I just said, I think, is that I made you, in a way, think like an ancient Cartesian philosopher by saying as if the brain wants, the person wants, but we don't believe that. The brain is us. When the brain wants something, we want something. There's no distinction. But somehow there's a distinction between those two personalities in your brain, the ones who make the clock, set the clock to 8 a.m., and the one that decides later to maybe give itself 10 more minutes, or the person that decided to have sex with someone without using any protection, not in this room, of course. The fact that, in a way, there is a change between who the puppet is and who the puppeteer. Who is making the decisions versus who is actually executing them. This guy on the left, Rodolfo Linas, is a professor at NYU that I really like because he does experiments that are incredible. He takes people, he sits them in a room and he tells them, I want you to press the buttons with either your left hand or your right hand, and you choose which one to use. And he puts a machine above their head, what's called TMS, transmagnetic stimulus, where he basically injects a little magnetic stimulus into their brain, making them make a movement. So what happens there is that the person sits there in the room and moves his right hand, presses the button, moves the left hand, left again, right, and does it again and again. And in the end, he asks the patient, did you feel that you choose yourself which hand to use for the button press? The patient says, oh, of course, doctor, I chose myself. Did you feel that you choose when to press the button? Of course I did. And then we zoom out, and we see that Rodolfo sits there in the back with a little keyboard and just presses move left, move right, move right, move left. Now, granted, it's only statistical, it doesn't work all the time. But what's interesting here is not the fact that you can make people do things by activating the motor cortex, by making them move their hand. What's interesting is that the patients have this feeling of agency. They feel that they chose. Even though we can show to them that someone pressed a button and a second later they move their right hand, they still somehow feel that they are the puppeteer. They are the ones in control of their behavior. And I think the most tangible experience that we have for that is emotions. Emotions like fear, sadness, anger, disgust are all emotions that we know very well. And what's interesting about them is that kind of like this moment where the button is pressed but Rodolfo is actually activating, emotions are never a choice that we make voluntarily. They kind of happen to us. We never say, oh, today I'm going to be sad at 2 p.m. I think I'm going to be happiness at 2:30. It kind of happens to us. We can affect our environment, but emotions are flowing through us. We suddenly get sad. We become afraid of things. So what's interesting about that is this is a very concrete experience that we have of how our brain makes somehow decisions and we are affected by them. And we can actually study now nicely how emotions know something about our choices better than we. If you look at people making decisions, you see that sometimes if you make decisions based on emotions, the decisions may be better for you than if you make them based on cognition. If I ask you to tell me, say, why you love your husband, or why you love your kids, you can come up with a list of things. You can say, I love this, and I love that, and I don't like this. But in reality, you don't know really how you can explain love. This is something that kind of happens to you. You can look at all the list of things there and remove them one by one, and you're going to still feel this thing, because it's something that goes through us. And what we do with our patients right now is exactly trying to play with these emotions. We try to find cells in their brain that sit next to emotions. So instead of finding cells that fire when the patient thinks of the Simpsons, we find cells that fire when the patient feels scared, when the patient feels happiness. And we can now tell the patient, here is your brain on happiness. Here is your brain on disgust. Here is your brain when you feel afraid of something. Now we're going to play a sound to you that indicates you're afraid of something, and we want you to learn how to control your feelings. We give them feedback on their feelings, and by learning to control their feelings, they actually learn how to affect their emotions. And suddenly they get access to this part of the brain that normally is just something that happens to us. We just kind of experience. And if you want, I can tell you in a second how they do that and what's interesting about the way the brain separates the positive and the negative emotions. I want to end by saying that I'm giving you the impression maybe that we're very close to understanding your brain. We're very far. We find isolated clusters of things. We understand some things about the brain, but we're still very far from having a clear picture of that. We know some things about the Simpsons, but we don't know why the Simpson sits next to a banana in the brain, or why it sits in the same place that Apple computers are and the Big Ben in London. We don't know yet why happiness sits in the front part of the brain, whereas fear and anger sit in a very basic, innocent part of the brain, and if it has something to do with how we perceive happiness versus how we perceive sadness. We don't know a lot. And I think that partially it is because if the brain was simple enough for us to understand it, then we would be too simple to understand it ourselves, because it's the organ we use to understand the brain. But I think it's definitely something worth pursuing and trying. Thank you.
Moran, I think that was really amazing. I don't know if you're aware of what he just said, basically that our brain makes the decisions unconsciously, obviously, before we consciously know that we've just made this decision. So this definitely brings up the question, where is what we conceive as free will? Even worse, what you say, the other example of, you can tell my brain, move your right arm, and I will tell you after, yes, I wanted to move it. So it seems like, and this is what Professor Singer said as well, I don't know if you remember, that our brain does things, and all we are doing, all we anyway, is to interpret or to give an explanation afterwards to give us the feeling, oh, Maria, just wanted it and did it. So we're all the time constructing our ego perception. What do you think about free will? Where's the free will in there?
So free will is a topic that the scientists, at least they get tenure or the Nobel Prize, should be not talking about.
You don't want to talk about it? Okay, we switch topic.
I'll tell you clearly. So this is a philosophical question, but it has some implications. And there's a lot of studies that are titled free will, and scientists are careful when they speak about that, but there's a way to save free will, even with the way I expressed things. So first of all, even if we say that there was a moment where a decision was made, and we became aware of that later, there's still room for free will. It just was made freely earlier than I perceived it. And even more so, there was a famous scientist in the 1980s, Benjamin Libet in San Francisco, who struggled clearly with dealing with free will, and he kind of created the idea of this clock experiment where things are dialed and you have to stop them. And he was very concerned that if things happen in our brain before we perceive them as free, then maybe there's no free will. And he found a way to save it by saying, well, your brain makes a choice, but you can still veto that. So you still have the free will.
You can still what?
Veto. You can still stop it. Like you can still say, okay, you know what?
Well, but I don't know if any of you know this. I have experienced myself sitting in front of the TV, it's late in the evening, and I'm wondering, should I shut the TV off? Should I shut it off? No, now, should I shut it off? And suddenly I see my arm switching off. And I'm like, whoa, somebody or something has taken the decision even before I was so aware, okay, now is the right moment to do so.
How do you think?
Or am I crazy? Maybe I'm
a lot of experiences, we walk the streets and we kind of are interested in something internally, and then we wake up a minute later and we realize that we walked a mile, or reading a book and we kind of stop reading and wake up a page later and see, oh, my eyes actually read this thing, and something is retained, but mostly I moved on. Our brain is able to do one thing and totally move away, and the mechanisms that actually make decisions are still there. So you can actually make good decisions on how to, you actually read, you don't read any line, but your eyes move at the pace of reading, as if you're reading, because your brain knows how to think like it's reading, even though it's somewhere else.
Moran has mentioned one thing, what I, just to finish this discussion, think is absolutely striking to me, which I didn't realize. You said that emotions like sadness and fears are in amygdala. Amygdala is part of the old brain, the reptilian brain, and that happiness or things like well-being or feeling, contempt is in our forehead, which is a much more developed neocortex. I mean, this is normally we would think like, okay, happiness occurs when sadness isn't here. First of all, how comes that sadness and fear are down there and happiness up there?
So this is fascinating to me as well, where we find emotions in the brain. So we indeed find that the more primal and basic emotions are sitting in the center of the brain, in what's called the limbic system, the thing that we share with a lot of other animals like monkeys and rats, and we actually can attribute those feelings to them. We often say the rat in the maze is scared or it's disgusted by things, whereas happiness we find mostly in the prefrontal cortex, the frontal part that is more modern and more new. And we find that interesting that in a way there's a chance that happiness is something that evolved a little bit later. And one of the suggestions is that maybe happiness is a mechanism that we have to reflect on itself. In a way, you can think of it that pain and anger and fear are there to save our lives. They're there to stop us from looking at the snake, run away, to stop us from eating bad food, whereas happiness is something that is more reflective and requires more kind of a conscious narrative creation of the brain. In a way, you can say that pain is there to save our life, whereas happiness is there to make our lives better. Live longer versus live better is the way
I think this is a very, very interesting finding and kind of a relief, because we get all sort of overwhelmed with these books and that is like teaching us how to be happy and pretending like being happy is basically the natural state of human being, and we kind of feel guilty if we're not always happy. I don't know if some of you know that feeling. I do know that feeling, and I think it's quite a kind of a relief to know that the brain basically was designed to protect us. That's why we can be fearful and sad and all that. And that happiness is part of a narrative and is part of a more elevated cortical process, cerebral process.
That also takes work.
A very exciting process. And Moran, for sure, I mean, you said that how could a human with a brain understand how the brain works? I think you're talking so fast that I guess you might be the one to be able to overrun the normal thing the brain do. Thank you very much, Moran. Thank you.